Hey guys, tonight we are wandering into the strangely morbid bookkeeping of the Middle Ages, because nothing says sweet dreams like counting how many people didn't wake up after a medieval battle. Picture this, you're standing ankle-deep in mud, the fog clings to your cloak, and somewhere in the distance a horn is blaring. You squint, half asleep already, and wonder who exactly is keeping track of all these bodies? Spoiler. The answer is usually some half-bored monk who wasn't even there. And already you probably won't survive the stroll through history, your shoes aren't sturdy enough, and your immune system doesn't come with the medieval expansion pack. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? And what time is it for you? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle forward into the middle of the field, and the first thing that hits you is how silent the aftermath is. Not the heroic trumpeting Hollywood soundtrack silence, but the eerie, too quiet kind, broken only by a crow that's already clocked in for its shift. Medieval chroniclers liked to write big numbers for these moments. 10,000 slain, because a big, round number looks impressive when you're trying to make your lord seem like a winner. The truth? Most medieval battles involved a few hundred, maybe a couple thousand men. Still enough to make your modern office drama look very survivable by comparison. You try to count in your head, 1 body, 2 bodies, 3. But the mud sucks at your boots and you lose track. That's the point, really, no one actually knew. Historians still argue whether body counts in chronicles were meant as actual records or as literary flair, like adding extra glitter to a party invitation. The monk scribbling away in a candlelit scriptorium wasn't on the field. He was relying on gossip, hearsay, and probably the medieval equivalent of "my cousin's friend swore he saw it." One quirky tidbit. Sometimes chroniclers didn't even bother counting at all. They just used words like innumerable or countless, which basically translates to, "we gave up after 20. And occasionally, they'd throw in strange details to pad out the story. 3 war horses drowned in the marsh, or 4 banners were lost, and 5 men fell asleep before the fight even started. Okay, that last one is me, but you get the idea. You wander to the edge of the field and notice how the dead are already being bundled away, not lovingly, but because the smell gets unbearable quickly. In the Middle Ages, mass graves were the fast, practical option. No time for stone monuments unless the fallen happened to be rich or very, very holy. If you're not either, you get stacked like firewood, covered in dirt, and forgotten by spring. It's a little harsh, but hey, so was medieval weather. What's fascinating is that the body count was often less about the dead themselves and more about bragging rights. A king could claim, "I slew 15,000 of the enemy," even if his entire army was only 5,000 strong. You're probably raising your eyebrows here, but remember, nobody back then could fact-check with a quick Google search. Numbers were more like propaganda tools, a way to puff up your chest and scare off the neighbors. Imagine yourself sitting by the campfire that night, the soldiers exaggerating over mugs of ale. "I cut down 20 men myself," one boasts. You glance at his tiny arms and wonder if he could even carry a sword for 20 minutes. But in a culture where stories were the currency of memory, exaggeration was half the point. Historians still argue whether some of the most famous body counts, like the claimed 100,000 at certain Mongol victories, were remotely possible, or whether they were literary fireworks to drive home how terrifying the victors seemed. And as you trudge along, you can almost feel that gap between what actually happened and what the chroniclers wanted you to believe. The funny thing is, body counts weren't just about warfare. Even in natural disasters or plagues, medieval writers would reach for round, dramatic numbers. A village wiped out by flooding might be described as 1,000 souls taken by the river, even if the whole population was barely 100. It's like medieval math came with a permanent rounding up policy. And here's a softer moment for you to picture as you nod off. The battlefield grass grows back surprisingly quickly. Within weeks, sheep might graze there again, oblivious to the carnage that once made the headlines. You, lying back and listening to the breeze, can almost forget the numbers too. They dissolve into the soil, just like the bones beneath it. Of course, you probably wouldn't have made it past breakfast in this era anyway. One scratch from a rusty blade, one sneeze from someone with the sniffles, and boom, your body count just got added to the anonymous tally. But don't worry, here, in the gentle hum of your own room, you're safe to keep listening. You shuffle a little farther down the centuries, and suddenly the mud under your boots feels different, thicker somehow, heavier with the weight of memory. You've landed in 1066, a year that English schoolchildren can recite the way you might list your favorite pizza toppings. Hastings, that one word, stamped into history like a knight's boot print in damp turf. You stand on the slope where the Anglo-Saxons lined up, shields tight like a well-rehearsed marching band, and across the field you see the Normans gathering, horses stamping, banners flapping like noisy laundry. It all looks rather organized for what was essentially the messiest brawl of the age. You want to know the number, of course, the tally of who fell. But, as usual, no one actually agrees. Mainstream historians will tell you that around 7,000 men fought on each side. Out of those, maybe a few thousand died. Reasonable, right? But chroniclers at the time loved throwing around higher figures. Some Norman sources say the Anglo-Saxon dead alone numbered in the tens of thousands, which is mathematically suspicious when you consider the size of the armies to begin with. It's as if every quill in Europe had its own favorite exaggeration setting. And then there's Harold, the English king with the world's worst eye appointment. The story that he was shot in the eye with an arrow is so famous that it feels definitive. Yet historians still argue whether it was really an arrow, a sword blow, or just a later embroidery upgrade to spice up the Bayeux tapestry. You glance up at the tapestry in your imagination and notice how the little stitched soldiers all look a bit stiff, like action figures arranged by a very patient child. It's charming, but probably not a reliable police report. A quirky tidbit here. After the battle, William the Conqueror supposedly had trouble getting Harold's body identified. Too mangled, too messy, too much medieval chaos. In one account, it's Harold's mistress who recognizes him, by markings only she would know. Romantic in a grim way, though probably the least romantic reunion imaginable. You walk through the imagined aftermath. The Anglo-Saxons, once confident on the hill, now scattered, their shield wall broken like a dropped tray of dishes. The Normans picking through the field, finding horses, weapons, maybe the occasional shiny helmet worth dragging home. The body count, depending on which source you pick, could be 2,000 or 6,000, or something so inflated that it would require ghost reinforcements to make sense. And here's a thought for you. While we focus on the soldiers, the villagers nearby had their own version of counting. Not the fallen warriors, but the number of sheep stolen, the barns burned, the families displaced. For them, the body count was measured in ruined harvests and empty beds, not just dead men on a slope. You lean on your imaginary spear and listen to the arguments echo across the centuries. Did Harold die with his brothers beside him, nobly defending the line? Or was it a frantic collapse, men dropping one by one until the hill was just a bloody slide? Historians still argue whether Hastings was a decisive slaughter or just an unusually unlucky day for the English crown. What's certain is that the numbers you see in chronicles are as much performance as record. One Norman scribe writes of heaps of the dead so tall that one might climb them like ladders, which honestly sounds like the world's least fun playground. Yet the hyperbole sticks in your mind because it was meant to. Numbers in the Middle Ages weren't just data, they were theater staged for memory and politics. So here you are, listening to the wind where the bodies once lay. You can almost hear a monk muttering, quill scratching, trying to decide whether to write thousands or innumerable. You're tempted to suggest a footnote, somewhere between a few and a lot, but the parchment doesn't take your edits. The battlefield grows quiet again. The grass will cover the scars. The numbers will drift into legend, and Harold will keep his stitched arrow in the tapestry forever, even if it's more rumor than reality. You lie back in the cool grass, letting the round figures swirl into the dark. 2,000, 6,000, countless. Pick whichever helps you drift off easiest. You rub your eyes, take a slow step forward, and suddenly the damp Sussex hillside has vanished. Now the horizon stretches wide and flat, a sea of grass and dust that goes on forever. You're in the Mongol steppe, where counting bodies is less about scribes with quills and more about who has the spare time to stack skulls before dinner. The Mongol armies under Genghis Khan and his descendants have earned a reputation for body counts so enormous that modern historians read the numbers and blink very, very slowly. Mainstream accounts say the Mongol conquests may have led to tens of millions of deaths, though that includes wars, sieges, and the collateral hunger and disease that followed. One famous claim is that when they took the city of Nishapur in Persia, 1.7 million people were killed. That's a staggering figure, but here's the quirky part. The city probably didn't even have that many residents. Historians still argue whether these were actual body counts, or if someone's quill simply slipped into the realm of fantasy. You trudge into an imagined Mongol camp. Fires crackle, horses munch on grain, and warriors lounge around telling stories of how many enemies they personally struck down. It's a bit like an ancient sleepover, except instead of s'mores, they've got fermented mare's milk. The air smells of smoke and leather, and you're half tempted to sit cross-legged and join in, though your polyester hoodie might give you away as not being from around here. What's striking is that Mongol chroniclers themselves weren't the ones boasting these insane numbers. It was usually their enemies. Muslim and Chinese historians tended to record the body counts with extra flair, maybe because the shock value helped drive home the terror of the unstoppable horde. If you've ever inflated the number of mosquitoes in your bedroom just to get sympathy, you understand the logic. And yet, the Mongols weren't shy about theatrics either. One tidbit you can't shake. Tamerlane, a later Central Asian conqueror inspired by Mongol tactics, was said to build literal pyramids of skulls after his victories. Whether he stacked them himself like a morbid game of Jenga is debatable, but the image was enough to make future enemies surrender before a fight even started. Body counts, in this sense, weren't numbers on paper, they were props in psychological warfare. You sit down on a patch of dry grass and look out at the endless horizon, and it dawns on you how different Mongol warfare was from, say, Hastings. This wasn't a single muddy hill with a few thousand casualties. This was wave after wave of campaigns, sweeping across cities, kingdoms, continents. In just one siege, Baghdad in 1258, the chroniclers claimed hundreds of thousands dead, a figure so high that later scholars quietly raise their eyebrows and suggest it might have been somewhat exaggerated. Still, the idea of Baghdad's libraries going up in smoke has haunted imaginations ever since, a different kind of counting loss. There's another strange little note. The Mongols were meticulous about counting things they actually cared about, horses, herds, tribute, but when it came to enemy casualties, numbers became slippery, dramatic, almost artistic. You imagine a Mongol commander giving an after-battle report. "Yes, my lord, we defeated them. Oh, the casualties? Let's call it round number 1,000,000, very impressive, please don't fact-check." Historians still argue whether the Mongols really caused more deaths than any other empire, or whether their enemies simply told the loudest stories. Either way, their reputation for astronomical body counts has stuck, and you can almost hear the echo of galloping hooves across the grass. A reminder that sometimes history's scariest numbers are the ones no one can pin down. As you close your eyes for a moment, the wind brushes past like the rush of cavalry, and you feel yourself nodding off in the endless rhythm of hooves and dust. Numbers blur in your mind, thousands, millions, perhaps just countless. And the steppe stretches out, vast, quiet, and softly terrifying. You rub the sleep dust from your eyes, and the grassland horizon slowly fades into sandstone walls and the hot, dry air of the Levant. The Mongol hooves have quieted, replaced now with the shuffle of pilgrims' sandals and the rustle of banners marked with crosses and crescents. You've wandered into the Crusades, where body counts take on a particularly strange flavor. Part holy bookkeeping, part political brag sheet, and part campfire ghost story designed to make the next recruit swallow his doubts. The year is 1099, and you're drifting along with the Crusader host as it lumbers toward Jerusalem. It's not glamorous. More like a medieval road trip with too many blisters, not enough snacks, and a very dubious bathroom situation. You can smell the sweat of unwashed soldiers, hear the creak of overloaded wagons, and feel the dust coating your teeth. When they finally stormed Jerusalem, the chroniclers claim the streets ran red with blood, up to the knees of the horses. That's the quote you'll hear repeated, and it sounds terrifying, cinematic, apocalyptic. But pause. Historians still argue whether that was a literal measurement or just a very enthusiastic metaphor for a lot of dead people. The mainstream fact is that the First Crusade did indeed lead to a massacre in Jerusalem, with thousands of inhabitants killed. Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christians caught in the chaos. But quirky little details reveal how the story got polished for maximum drama. One chronicler adds that the Crusaders happily waded through the carnage singing hymns, as though medieval knights were also auditioning for the creepiest choir competition ever. Whether anyone could actually sing over that chaos is questionable. You tiptoe into the city square, trying not to imagine what your shoes are squishing through, and notice the numbers vary wildly depending on who wrote the account. Some Muslim sources inflate the casualty lists to emphasize the brutality, while some Christian sources inflate them to make the victory seem more miraculous. Either way, the body counts serve the same purpose. They're not really about the dead, but about shaping how the living remember the event. And then there's the odd little side note that Crusader chroniclers sometimes counted relics and holy objects in the same breath as casualties. You might read a line like, 10,000 slain, 1 golden chalice recovered, 3 saints' bones located, as though all of that belonged in the same spreadsheet. Imagine your office manager tallying budget cuts right alongside who brought donuts to the meeting. It makes no sense, but it feels oddly familiar. The debate continues centuries later. Did 10,000 really die in Jerusalem? 20,000? Or was it closer to a few thousand? Historians still argue whether medieval population estimates of the city even allowed for the higher figures. It's possible the writers exaggerated so heavily that the modern reader is left trying to sift myth from math. Step back for a second. The Crusaders themselves weren't even consistent. In Antioch, 2 years earlier, some chroniclers said the body count was so high that no one could bury the dead, while others wrote about citizens calmly returning to market within days. Which is it? Were the streets ankle-deep in misery? Or was it back to shopping for figs before the week was out? The inconsistency tells you everything. Numbers were narrative tools, adjusted like stage lighting depending on who was in the audience. A quirky anecdote for you. At one point, a chronicler in Antioch claimed that God sent a vision of the lance of Longinus, the spear that pierced Christ, buried under the city. Once discovered, the morale of the Crusaders shot up because clearly divine props make for great theater. You half expect the same chronicler to scribble, also 1 million enemies defeated today, just to keep the magic rolling. As you lean against a sun-warmed wall, you notice something else. For the locals, the peasants, the traders, the families just trying to survive, the body count was personal, not theatrical. It meant missing sons, missing fathers, vanished neighbors. Their tally wasn't written in chronicles, but in empty chairs at the evening meal. That part never gets embroidered into tapestries. The voices of monks and muezzins fade into the hot wind, and you realize the numbers will always blur, shifting with every retelling. Was it thousands or merely hundreds? Was it a sea of blood or just the smoke of exaggerated memory? You let the uncertainty wash over you like the heat shimmer on the horizon. The hot Jerusalem stones fade beneath your feet, and you stumble into an entirely different battlefield. One that doesn't involve swords, arrows, or shields at all. The enemy here is smaller than a grain of sand, invisible, and far deadlier than even the fiercest crusader. You've stepped into the 14th century, and the body count is no longer measured in fallen knights, but in villages emptied overnight. The Black Death has arrived, And suddenly all those battlefield numbers look like warm-up exercises. Picture yourself wandering a narrow medieval street. The cobbles are slick not with blood this time, but with refuse, spoiled food, and chamber pots emptied from windows. The air smells like a mixture of smoke, damp wool, and something less pleasant you'd rather not identify. And somewhere nearby, a cart creaks slowly past, its driver calling for the dead to be brought out. You press yourself against the wall, trying not to breathe too deeply. Mainstream historians estimate that between 75 and 200 million people died across Europe, Asia, and North Africa between 1347 and 1351. That's not just a battle lost. It's as if an entire civilization decided to lie down at once. The numbers are so staggering that chroniclers struggled to write them down. Some gave up and just scribbled phrases like, "A third of all souls perished." It's like the medieval version of shrugging and saying, "Honestly, everyone I know," and yet quirky details slip through. In some towns, grave diggers refused to work unless they were paid triple, because hey, supply and demand doesn't stop for plague. In Venice, ships were forced to anchor offshore for 40 days, a quarantina before docking, which is where we get the word quarantine. You may be tired of that word in your own era, but imagine inventing it because the alternative was inviting the plague to your dinner table. You pass a house with a red cross painted on the door, a sign that sickness has claimed the family inside. No swords, no arrows, just silence. Children's toys lie abandoned in the dirt. It feels different from the battlefield. Quieter, more private, yet the numbers dwarf any war you've heard of so far. Historians still argue whether the plague killed half of Europe or closer to a third, and whether certain regions, like Poland, mysteriously fared better. Was it geography, luck, or just better bread? The debates linger, like the smell of herbs people wore in pouches around their necks, hoping they could ward off the invisible killer. Spoiler, the herbs didn't work. You catch a glimpse of a doctor in a beaked mask waddling past, stuffed with sweet-smelling flowers. He looks like a bird auditioning for a very depressing carnival. The mask probably didn't help much either, but it gave people a sense of safety, like medieval PPE cosplay. Here's a strange little note. Some chroniclers describe how entire monasteries were wiped out, not one monk left alive. Others record how village cats and dogs were killed en masse, blamed for carrying the plague. Ironically, that only worsened things, since rodents, actual plague spreaders, had fewer predators left to keep them in check. So yes, medieval pest control was about as successful as your attempt to diet after buying a family-sized bag of cookies. And yet, in the middle of so much despair, life went on. Markets reopened, marriages continued, music played in taverns. Because what else could people do? The body count was massive, but the resilience was quietly remarkable. Picture yourself sitting by a hearth, listening to someone strum a lute, while outside the world's numbers keep ticking higher and higher. When you think back to Hastings or Jerusalem, those bloody tallies seem almost manageable compared to the sheer scale of this invisible war. No battlefield, no glorious banners, just households disappearing one by one, until entire towns became nothing but ghostly echoes. The chroniclers tried to give it numbers, but really the plague was innumerable in the truest sense. You take a slow breath, as though through that bird mask yourself, and let the enormity of it blur in your mind. Was it 75 million, or closer to 200? Thousands per day, or whole provinces in a week? The truth lies somewhere in that haze, like the fog of a candlelit street after midnight. And as you sink lower into your blanket, you realize that sometimes the greatest medieval battle wasn't fought with steel at all. It was fought in silence, in locked houses, and in the endless scratching of quills trying to make sense of a number that could never be counted. The streets of plague-struck Europe fade behind you, and your boots now squelch into something far more familiar. Mud, glorious mud, and the faint smell of horses. Welcome to the 100 Years' War, which, spoiler alert, didn't last exactly 100 years. It actually went on for about 116. You sigh because clearly medieval math wasn't any more precise with calendars than it was with body counts. Picture yourself trudging beside weary soldiers, their armor dented and streaked with rust. It's raining again. Of course it's raining again, and the battlefield is a swampy canvas of confusion. If you're hoping for clean, dramatic numbers, forget it. Chroniclers reported figures as though they'd been pulled out of a hat, shaken around with a few prayers, and then dramatically inked on parchment. Take the Battle of Crécy in 1346. English chroniclers claimed the French lost 30,000 men, which sounds terrifyingly impressive, except the French army probably only had about 20,000 there to begin with. Someone clearly got carried away with their zeros. Historians still argue whether the actual casualties were closer to 3,000 or 10,000, but you can see how 30 has a nicer ring when you're trying to make Edward III look like a medieval action hero. Meanwhile, the English proudly insisted they lost very few men at Crécy, maybe a few hundred at most. Imagine the camp that night. English soldiers laughing into their ale. "Oh yes, we tripped over the French in heaps, barely broke a sweat." You roll your eyes because you've heard that tone before, probably from your friend who swears they once benched 300 pounds in high school. Here's a quirky tidbit. The English longbowmen really were devastating, but not quite wipe out 30,000 devastating. Chroniclers described the sky darkening with arrows, like a thundercloud of death. One even wrote that the rain of shafts was so heavy, it hid the sun, which makes you picture a knight squinting up, wondering if he should have brought an umbrella instead of a broadsword. And then there's Agincourt in 1415, immortalized by Shakespeare. Henry V's small English army defeated a much larger French force, and the chroniclers couldn't resist pumping up the numbers. Some claimed 40,000 French were killed or captured. More sober modern estimates? Maybe 7 to 10,000 dead. Still horrendous, but not quite the apocalyptic mountain of corpses described in the plays. You can almost hear Shakespeare, centuries later, polishing the lines with his quill. "Once more unto the breach," has a much better ring than "somewhat fewer died than expected." You find yourself standing ankle-deep in the mud at Agincourt, listening to the squelch of boots and the whinny of terrified horses. The French knights, heavy in armor, struggled to move in the muck, while English archers skipped about more freely, loosing arrows into the chaos. It's a scene of panic, not precise arithmetic. And yet, once the dust and rain settled, the scribes had to put a number to it. Historians still argue whether Agincourt's body count was inflated for national pride or propaganda, or whether the shocking disparity in losses was actually true. Either way, the story of heroic few versus countless many has echoed through the centuries. Numbers, after all, make legends easier to swallow. And in case you think this war was one long stretch of epic clashes, here's another odd note. Much of the 100 Years' War was downtime, truce periods, raids on sheep, skirmishes no bigger than a neighborhood brawl. Yet chroniclers sometimes lumped all the casualties together, creating totals that looked far grander than the reality. Imagine padding your resume by counting every paper cut as a workplace injury. As you sit on a damp log, rain dripping down your nose, you can't help but laugh quietly. The 100 Years' War may have been full of noble speeches and stirring tales, but its body counts are as muddy and slippery as the ground beneath your feet. Numbers stretch and shrink depending on who's telling the story. So you lean back, listening to the patter of rain on battered helmets, and let the contradictions swirl together. Was it thousands or tens of thousands? Did arrows truly blot out the sun? Or was that just poetic drizzle? The truth, like the battlefield mud, sticks stubbornly to your boots but never quite takes shape. The damp mud of Agincourt seeps away beneath your boots, and suddenly you're standing on dry, cracked earth beneath a blazing Central Asian sun. The banners here are not French or English. They belong to Timur, better known as Tamerlane, a man who took the Mongol legacy of conquering and gave it an especially theatrical twist. And when I say theatrical, I mean literal set pieces. pyramids of human skulls stacked high enough to give even the most cheerful villager a serious case of insomnia. Mainstream history books agree that Tamerlane's campaigns in the late 14th and early 15th centuries caused catastrophic casualties across Persia, India, Syria, and beyond. But the numbers, they make you rub your eyes and wonder if some chronicler was just having a little too much fun. At the sack of Delhi in 1398, for instance, one source claims he killed 100,000 captives in a single day. A neat, round figure, too neat, really, like a math test answer scribbled by someone who just didn't care anymore. Historians still argue whether that number was inflated tenfold, but the legend stuck. You walk through an imagined camp after Delhi, and the scene is bizarre. Soldiers are hammering away at wooden scaffolds, arranging skulls in careful pyramids. Not exactly a hobby you'd put on a dating profile. The gruesome construction wasn't just about frightening the enemy, it was about broadcasting the body count to the world in 3D form. No one needed parchment or quills. The skulls themselves did the reporting. Here's a quirky tidbit. In Aleppo, after one of his victories, Timur supposedly ordered 20,000 heads to be piled into towers. Some chroniclers say the piles were arranged like architectural projects, carefully mortared for stability. Imagine walking past that as a medieval tourist. Ah yes, here's our local landmark. Please don't lean against it, it's not load-bearing. Of course, Timur's empire wasn't built only on theatrics. He really did lead ferocious campaigns that devastated entire regions. In Baghdad, around 1401, some accounts report 90,000 killed in a single sack. Others say the figure was closer to 20,000, but either way, it was catastrophic. The chroniclers simply couldn't resist adding extra zeros like sprinkles on an already over-the-top dessert. You glance around and notice something odd. While the soldiers gloat about their pyramids, the local scribes are quietly tallying in ledgers. Lost households, abandoned farms, vanished markets. For them, the body count wasn't just the stacks of skulls but the collapse of daily life. How many bakers gone, how many weavers vanished, how many children with no parents to tuck them in at night. Numbers of a different, quieter kind, but no less devastating. Historians still argue whether Timur killed more people than Genghis Khan or whether his reputation for cruelty has been overblown by his enemies. Some Persian chroniclers emphasized his brutality to make him look like God's scourge, while others tried to polish him into a cultured patron of architecture and poetry. The man commissioned stunning gardens and mosques, after all, even while turning cities into charnel houses. You wonder how he balanced his calendar. Monday, mass slaughter. Tuesday, poetry recital. As you sit in the dusty twilight, you realize the pyramids of skulls weren't just about numbers. They were monuments to memory. Medieval people lived in a world where stories mattered more than data, and nothing told a story faster than a towering reminder of mortality. You squint up at one such pyramid now, the hollow eye sockets staring back down at you. It's oddly hypnotic, in a grim, sleepy way. You stretch out on the warm ground, the smell of smoke still clinging to the air, and the numbers blur together. Was it 20,000 or 100,000? A day's worth of slaughter or a chronicler's exaggeration? You'll never really know, and maybe that's the point. The body counts in Timur's world were always half statistics, half stagecraft. A performance etched in bone. The hot Central Asian dust softens under your feet, and now you're standing before massive stone walls. They rise so high you have to tilt your head back until your neck aches. Siege ladders lean, cannons boom, and the air is thick with smoke and shouting. You've stepped into the Ottoman world, where keeping track of fallen enemies and fallen friends wasn't just boasting. It was administration. The Ottomans loved lists, and their scribes had the tidy handwriting to prove it. Take the famous siege of Constantinople in 1453. Chroniclers wrote breathlessly about how the walls shook under the pounding of giant bombards. You're here now, feeling the ground tremble with each blast. The defenders, clinging to the last remnants of the Byzantine Empire, fought fiercely. Numbers vary as always, Some say only a few thousand Byzantines were left to defend the city. Others claim tens of thousands joined the effort, including foreign mercenaries who probably wondered why they'd signed up for this gig. As for casualties, Ottoman accounts sometimes bragged of minimal losses, while Byzantine sources lamented overwhelming numbers on their side. Historians still argue whether the final day's body count was in the tens of thousands or far less, but everyone agrees it was the end of an era. One quirky tidbit: Ottoman scribes sometimes recorded casualties by social category rather than raw numbers. You'll read entries like, so many janissaries fell, so many Sipahis, so many common volunteers. It's like a medieval Excel spreadsheet, except on parchment and without formulas. Imagine squinting at that by candlelight, wondering if you should round up your figures to impress the Sultan. You wander through the imagined Ottoman camp after a siege, and the atmosphere feels almost bureaucratic. There are clerks writing reports, tallying loot, recording which regiments lost how many men. Body counts became part of empire management, not just bragging. But even here, propaganda crept in. Victories were polished to shine brighter. Defeats were smudged until they looked less embarrassing. You suspect the scribes occasionally used creative accounting. Step into the Siege of Vienna in 1529. Chroniclers again tossed around figures like dice. Some claimed tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers died in the mud and rain. Others suggested the numbers were far lower. The Austrians inflated the statistics to make their defense sound heroic, while Ottoman records minimized the loss, so the Sultan didn't look like he'd wasted his time slogging through Central Europe's least vacation-friendly weather. And here's an odd little side note. The Ottomans were also fond of capturing enemies alive, especially for labor or ransom. That meant the body count didn't always include prisoners, who sometimes numbered in the thousands. For villagers swept up during campaigns, it made little difference whether you were counted as dead or carted off. The chroniclers were busy with their ledgers either way. You pause by the city gate, running your hand along the scorched stones. The sheer size of the Ottoman campaigns meant that even with careful scribes, the numbers blur. Some modern historians suggest Ottoman record-keeping was more reliable than most medieval sources, but even then, exaggerations slip through like smoke in a tent. Historians still argue whether Constantinople's fall was an unprecedented bloodbath or simply another siege amplified by centuries of retelling. And yet, amid all the ledgers and lists, ordinary people measured the toll differently. Families counted who didn't come home. Bakers noted how many loaves no longer sold. Merchants saw their stalls empty. Those tallies don't show up in official records, but they're just as real. You sit on a pile of stones in the cooling evening, hearing the faint scratching of quills in a scribe's tent. The ink dries, the numbers harden, and the story of victory takes shape. Whether it was 10,000 or 50,000, the chronicles ensure that the siege will be remembered as grand, terrible, and strangely tidy. As the campfire smoke drifts into the night, you close your eyes. You can almost hear the pages turning, the numbers shifting, and the centuries whispering. Fewer or more, it doesn't matter. The legend counts more than the count itself. The scorched stones of Constantinople melt away beneath your fingers, and suddenly you're standing on a misty hillside in medieval Japan. The grass whispers in the breeze, the cicadas buzz, and far off you hear the clash of steel and the twang of bowstrings. This isn't the grand, mud-soaked melee of Europe. It's quieter, more ritualized, but no less deadly. Here, body counts get tangled up with poetry, pride, and a curious sense of aesthetics. You find yourself at the Battle of Sekigahara in 1600, often considered the turning point that ushered in the Tokugawa shogunate. The chroniclers claimed that over 160,000 men clashed there, an astonishingly high number for a single Japanese battle. As for casualties, some sources say 30,000 dead, others a more modest 7,000. Historians still argue whether the lower estimates are closer to reality, but in the Japanese imagination, the figures grew with each retelling. The quirky part is how the deaths were often described. Instead of neat tallies, You might read about which clans were scattered like blossoms, or how warriors vanished like dew. Poetic, yes, but not very helpful if you're trying to do the math. Imagine asking your accountant for the quarterly numbers and getting back a haiku. You walk along a battlefield where samurai banners flutter like bright kites, and you notice that body counts here weren't always about faceless masses. Chroniclers focused instead on notable duels, the one-on-one clashes that determined honor. A single fallen general could weigh more heavily in the narrative than hundreds of anonymous soldiers. Numbers mattered, but names mattered more. And then there's the practice of head-taking. Victorious warriors presented the heads of defeated enemies as proof of kills. But here's where it gets odd. In the Sengoku period, there were so many heads to process after a battle that officials sometimes only demanded noses instead. Easier to carry, quicker to count. Yes, a nose census. You picture clerks lining up grisly bundles and carefully ticking boxes, like a very grim bakery order. Historians still argue whether head-taking inflated or deflated the true casualty numbers. On one hand, warriors might exaggerate their tally by borrowing someone else's trophy. On the other, some heads or noses never got counted at all if the clerks were overwhelmed. It's body counting, but filtered through bureaucracy and vanity. Here's a lighter note. Samurai chroniclers occasionally broke up the grim math with poetry composed right before death. A warrior might scrawl a final verse about the fleeting cherry blossoms or the morning mist. So while European chroniclers were tallying 10,000 slain, Japanese sources might record a single poem, leaving the actual numbers vague. It's oddly beautiful, if not exactly statistically useful. You crouch beside a stream at the edge of the battlefield. The water runs red in the chronicles, though in reality it probably ran brown with dirt. Villagers later wrote about how the streams carried away broken weapons, sandals, and less poetically, bits of armor too dented to reuse. Their memory of the body count wasn't in grand numbers, but in what washed up the next day. Step back further and you see the contrast. In Europe, the chroniclers inflated for drama. In Japan, the numbers were there, but always mingled with imagery, ritual, and an emphasis on honor. The casualty figures mattered, yes, but the story mattered more, the poem, the duel, the banner that fell. As the mist thickens, you lie back in the grass, listening to the rustle of bamboo in the wind. The numbers blur again. Was it 30,000, 7,000, or simply a field of scattered blossoms? You close your eyes, letting the poetry of it soften the grim arithmetic. The bamboo rustle fades, and you find yourself beneath a brilliant Saharan sky. The air is dry, the sand warm beneath your feet, and in the distance you hear the murmur of drums. You've crossed continents into the realms of medieval Africa, where chroniclers wrote in Arabic on long scrolls, merchants gossiped along caravan routes, and kings led armies so vast that the numbers sound almost impossible. Here, body counts swell not just from battle, but from the sheer imagination of the storytellers. You drift toward Timbuktu, a city of learning, manuscripts, and bustling markets. Chroniclers like those of the Tariq al-Sudan recorded the clashes of kingdoms such as Mali, Songhai, and Kanem-Bornu. Take the great Songhai Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries. Its battles were said to involve tens of thousands of troops. At the Battle of Tondabai in 1591, when Moroccan forces marched across the desert to face Songhai, the records suggest 40,000 Songhai warriors faced a mere 4,000 Moroccans. Casualties? Some say the Songhai dead filled the plains. Others whisper that most simply scattered when Moroccan firearms thundered for the first time. Historians still argue whether it was a decisive massacre or a demoralized rout. Here's the quirky bit. One chronicle claimed that Songhai warriors stampeded a herd of cattle toward the Moroccan lines as a shock tactic. The cattle, understandably confused, turned around and trampled their own side. That's not the kind of body count the scribes were eager to emphasize, but you can imagine the embarrassment. The numbers in African chronicles often balloon. Some tales speak of armies 100,000 strong, though modern historians doubt whether the logistics, feeding men and camels in a desert, could support such figures. Still, the exaggerated body counts carried meaning. They weren't just tallies, but signals of the empire's grandeur and the epic scope of their struggles. Step deeper into the Sahel and you hear the griots, oral historians, recounting the battles in rhythmic song. Instead of neat columns of the dead, they describe rivers that ran with men or fields that swallowed heroes whole. Numbers dissolve into imagery much like in Japan. You realize that in cultures where oral storytelling carried as much weight as written annals, body counts weren't always measured with ink, but with metaphor. But there were also practical lists. In Kanem-Bornu, rulers maintained records of tribute, soldiers, and even casualties after raids. It's said that one king, Dunima Dabalimi, led campaigns in the 13th century that brought back so many captives. Scribes barely bothered with the fallen. Prisoners were counted like coin, while the dead went into broad, imprecise categories. The body count was both a military report and an economic statement. Historians still argue whether the chroniclers of Timbuktu were inflating numbers to rival the grandeur of Islamic caliphs further north, or whether these armies really did march in such colossal strength. The truth is lost somewhere between desert mirages and scribal inkpots. You rest in the shade of a mud-brick mosque, listening to a griot's tale stretch into the night. The firelight flickers on his face as he sings of kings who commanded an army as countless as the stars. You almost smile, wondering if somewhere, a tired scribe tried to turn those stars into actual figures before giving up. The body counts of African medieval wars are slippery. Maybe 40,000, maybe 4,000. Maybe rivers of men, maybe herds of cattle turned traitor. But the legend, like the Sahara sky, stretches wider than numbers can measure. You exhale slowly, sand soft against your palm, as the griot's voice fades into the hum of crickets. The ink, the song, the sand, they all blur into one long ledger of memory, where the body count is less about mathematics and more about meaning. The desert wind hushes, and when you open your eyes you're standing in the middle of a muddy English village. The thatched roofs sag under a gray sky, the air smells faintly of smoke and manure, and somewhere nearby a church bell tolls. You're no longer wandering with kings and empires. You're surrounded by peasants, pitchforks in hand, voices raised not in song but in rebellion. This is the other side of medieval body counts. Uprisings where common people dared to rise, and the numbers of their dead were counted very differently, often brutally, often dismissively. Take the English peasants' revolt of 1381. It began with anger over poll taxes and ballooned into tens of thousands marching toward London. Chroniclers claimed that up to 60,000 joined the movement, though historians still argue whether the figure was exaggerated to emphasize the scale of the threat. At first, the rebels were surprisingly successful, storming prisons, burning documents, and even forcing meetings with the king. But once the crown regained control, the casualties stacked up. Some records say 1,500 rebels were executed in the aftermath. Others suggest closer to 7,000 across England. That's a pretty wide margin. Like telling you dinner will cost somewhere between $5 and $50. The quirky part? Many of those executed weren't soldiers at all, but scribes, clerks, and unlucky villagers who just happened to be in the wrong place with the wrong accent. There's even one account of rebels who spared tax collectors, briefly, because they needed someone to calculate their own lists. Imagine relying on your enemy's accountant to keep your rebellion organized. And England wasn't alone. In 14th century France, during the Jacquerie Uprising, peasant deaths were recorded as countless. The chroniclers, mostly nobles, didn't bother tallying. They preferred dramatic phrases like, "The land was cleared of vermin," not exactly helpful if you're trying to draw a chart. Historians still argue whether the numbers reached tens of thousands or whether chroniclers simply erased peasants by rounding them down to zero. Further east, in the German lands, the Bundschuh and Hussite uprisings produced body counts just as muddled. The Hussite Wars in particular gave us both meticulous tallies of battlefield dead and wildly inflated estimates of how many rebels were purged afterward. Sometimes body counts were propaganda, a ruler claiming to have slain 10,000 rebels when maybe he scattered a few hundred. Other times they were minimized, scribes quietly erasing the numbers to suggest everything was under control. The rebellions highlight a strange irony. When elites fought each other, every knight's death was recorded, catalogued, sometimes even sung about. But when peasants died, the counts dissolved into vagueness or were written off with contempt. It's as though numbers themselves became a tool of hierarchy. Here's a lighter aside for you. In some records of German uprisings, peasants are listed not by name but by occupation. So the body count might read, 3 cobblers, 2 millers, 1 brewer. It reads less like a massacre and more like a recipe. You lean against a wooden fence, listening to the distant shouts of a crowd. The air is tense, as if something is about to snap. And when it does, when rebellion turns to massacre, the numbers become slippery, the dead uncounted, their memory blurred. But the fear they inspired was real enough that kings, dukes, and bishops had to inflate the figures afterward, just to justify their brutal response. Historians still argue whether these uprisings were doomed from the start or whether, with a bit more luck, they might have forced lasting change. What is clear is that their body counts live in the shadows, larger in rumor than in fact, smaller in records than in truth. The bell tolls again, the crowd's voices fade, and you close your eyes. The peasant's story lingers not in exact numbers, but in the uneasy hush of villages where rebellion once echoed. The church bell fades, and when you open your eyes again, the air has changed. It's heavier, warmer, and scented faintly with maize and cocoa. You're standing on a broad causeway, overlooking dazzling stone temples and colorful murals. This is Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire, though it won't remain unconquered for long. Tonight, you drift into the world of Spanish conquests, where body counts grew tangled in war, ritual, and the invisible toll of disease. At first glance, the numbers seem straightforward. Conquistadors like Hernán Cortés marched with a few hundred Spaniards, some horses, and a handful of cannons. They faced Aztec armies tens of thousands strong. Chroniclers claimed battles where 20,000 or 30,000 indigenous warriors fell, but historians still argue whether those figures reflect actual casualties or dramatic storytelling. After all, imagine trying to count bodies in the chaos of obsidian blades clashing against steel, with smoke, drums, and cries filling the night. One mainstream fact: during the siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521, chroniclers said 100,000 Aztecs perished. The city's canals, they wrote, were clogged with corpses, boats unable to move. Some accounts suggest closer to 40,000, while others imply most of the dead came not from Spanish steel but from famine and smallpox. Numbers blur between categories: battle deaths, starvation deaths, epidemic deaths, all wrapped into one enormous, tragic body count. Here's the quirky tidbit. Cortés himself was once nearly sacrificed during battle. Aztec warriors captured him and dragged him toward the altar, supposedly to add his heart to the tally of divine offerings. His comrades saved him, but you can't help picturing a footnote in some scribe's ledger. Also, one Spaniard almost counted, and yet, the greatest and quietest body count wasn't recorded with swords. European diseases like smallpox swept through the Americas, sometimes wiping out 50 to 90% of local populations within a century. That's not the kind of statistic a medieval scribe could comprehend. Imagine walking into a city of 200,000, then returning months later to find it eerily silent, the markets empty, temples abandoned. The dead weren't always visible on battlefields. Sometimes they vanished behind shuttered doors. Meanwhile, in the Inca Empire to the south, Spanish chroniclers claimed similar astronomical numbers. At the Battle of Cajamarca in 1532, Francisco Pizarro captured Atahualpa, the Inca emperor, with fewer than 200 men. Chroniclers boasted that thousands of Inca soldiers were slaughtered in one afternoon, though historians point out that Spanish steel and horses could not have cut down that many. Instead, panic and retreat likely caused more deaths than direct fighting. Historians still argue whether these conquest numbers were propaganda, designed to magnify Spanish bravery and divine favor, or whether they reflected genuine shock at the unfamiliar scale of indigenous armies. Either way, the body counts were inflated, manipulated, and endlessly debated. The sound of drums rises in your ears, low, steady, hypnotic. You realize that, to the Aztecs, counting the dead wasn't always about statistics. Sacrificial victims were tallied carefully, sometimes with precise tribute records, because each death was an offering to the gods. In their worldview, the body count was sacred accounting, not a historian's calculation. Spanish chroniclers, baffled, translated those numbers into battlefield carnage, missing the spiritual nuance. So you stand on this causeway, gazing at the lake where canoes once ferried warriors into battle. The water glimmers in moonlight, and you imagine it dotted with boats, filled with warriors shouting, paddling, colliding. Somewhere in the distance, a voice whispers a figure, 10,000, 50,000, 100,000, and you realize the number is less fact than memory, less statistic than myth. And as you exhale, the city begins to blur, stone temples melting into shadows, the body count dissolving like mist. What remains is not the exact tally, but the scale of loss, too vast for neat columns, too deep for sleep, yet somehow strangely soothing in its distance. The shimmering waters of Tenochtitlan fade, and when you next open your eyes, the air feels cooler, heavier, tinged with wood smoke and candle wax. You're seated in a dim medieval courtroom. The benches creak, the parchment crackles, and the crowd whispers nervously as a trial begins. Tonight you drift into the eerie arithmetic of witch trials, where body counts weren't measured on battlefields, but in court ledgers and execution registers, each death tallied with unsettling neatness. At first, you notice how bureaucratic it all seems. Trials begin with accusations, sometimes sparked by jealousy, sometimes by crop failures, sometimes just because a neighbor's cow keeled over. A notary scribbles down the names, a clerk enters them into the book, and suddenly someone's fate is reduced to a line of ink. One mainstream fact: across Europe between the 15th and 17th centuries, scholars estimate between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft. But here's the odd part. Despite the scale, in most villages, it only took a few deaths to terrify everyone else into silence. The quirky tidbit: in some German towns, witch trials became so profitable that officials practically ran them like fundraisers. Fines, confiscated property, fees for torture equipment, every detail went into the books. There's even a record of one town charging the accused for the rope used to hang them. Imagine being billed for your own execution. Talk about customer service gone wrong. Historians still argue whether these numbers represent mass hysteria spiraling out of control or cold, calculated opportunism by local elites. In Scotland, for example, casualty counts from witch hunts fluctuate wildly depending on which chronicle you trust. Sometimes a handful, sometimes hundreds. Was it exaggeration for drama, or deliberate minimization to downplay cruelty? The debate continues. You lean back in the wooden chair, letting the rhythm of the trial wash over you. Accusation, interrogation, verdict, execution, repeat. The courtroom murmurs like a lullaby if you ignore the content. And when the sentence is carried out, the clerk records it with chilling detachment. One more line, one more tally mark, one more body count to add to the ledger. What's stranger still is how unevenly distributed these numbers were. In Spain, under the Inquisition, surprisingly few witches were executed compared to Northern Europe. In parts of Poland and the Holy Roman Empire, entire waves of executions wiped out dozens of villagers at once, the counts climbing like a grim staircase. In England, by contrast, the numbers were relatively modest. though modest in this case still meant hundreds of lives. And yet, even here, humor creeps in. One chronicler complained about the cost of keeping prisoners fed while awaiting execution, suggesting bread rations be cut in half to speed the process. You can almost hear the bureaucratic sigh. Witch hunts were exhausting paperwork. The fire in the hearth crackles, the ink dries, and the courtroom empties. You sit alone now, the ledgers stacked around you like walls. Each page filled with names, each tally mark a life. And as your eyes grow heavy, the numbers blur into meaningless lines, no different than rows of sheep you might count to drift off. The witch trials remind you, sometimes the medieval body count wasn't wild exaggeration. Sometimes it was depressingly exact. And that exactness, rows of names neatly written, is perhaps more chilling than any inflated claim of thousands slain. The candle sputters, the room darkens, and you close your eyes. The murmurs of the court dissolve into silence, and the only sound left is the soft scratch of an unseen pen, endlessly counting. The candle gutters out, and as the smoke drifts upward, you find yourself standing before vast stone walls. They loom so high you tilt your head back just to follow their line. The ground trembles faintly beneath your feet, as if thousands of boots are marching nearby. Tonight, you wander through the great sieges of the medieval world, where body counts ballooned not just from swords and arrows, but from hunger, disease, and time itself. One mainstream fact stands before you: the siege of Constantinople in 1453, when the Ottomans finally breached the mighty walls of the Byzantine capital. Chroniclers said tens of thousands perished. Some accounts claim 50,000, others closer to 7,000. The numbers shift like shadows depending on who was writing. To the Byzantines, every death felt monumental. To the Ottomans, recording enemy casualties inflated the glory of victory. Historians still argue whether the city's defenders were annihilated in a grand massacre or absorbed quietly into the new imperial fold. You walk along the ramparts, tracing the stones with your fingers. Imagine being trapped inside a besieged city. Food dwindling, water foul, rats suddenly considered a delicacy. Body counts here weren't only measured by soldiers slain at the gate. They were measured by the slow, unseen toll of famine. Here's the quirky tidbit. During the siege of Acre in 1189, chroniclers tell of desperate defenders hurling beehives over the walls. Not exactly a high-tech weapon, but surprisingly effective. Did the casualties from angry bees make it into the body counts? Probably not, but you can bet the survivors remembered. Elsewhere, at the siege of Antioch in 1098, it said the starving crusaders resorted to eating leather, grass, even, let's politely call it, unmentionable things. Chroniclers wrote that tens of thousands died, though whether from combat or hunger is impossible to untangle. Imagine historians centuries later scratching their heads. Was this 10,000 dead soldiers, or 10,000 people who skipped dinner one too many times? And still, the math shifts depending on who tells the tale. In Chinese history, the siege of Xiangyang, 1267 to 1273, against the Mongols lasted 6 years. Some chronicles estimate 100,000 dead, while others barely hazard a guess, knowing that famine deaths can't be neatly penciled in. The sound around you shifts. Muffled drums outside the wall, the groan of a hungry crowd inside. You realize that siege body counts are unlike battlefield ones. There's no climactic clash, no neat tally of slain foes. Instead, it's a slow erosion, day after day, until the survivors surrender or starve. Historians still argue whether the chroniclers of sieges exaggerated for pity or prestige. Was Constantinople really drowned in a sea of corpses? Did Antioch's death toll rival entire battles? Or were these stories inflated because nothing drives home drama like a big, round number? You lean against the wall, listening as the sounds fade. The footsteps of soldiers outside grow faint. The cries of the starving soften into echoes, until all that's left is silence. A siege, after all, is about waiting, and waiting is just another way of drifting toward sleep. So, As your eyes close, the stone walls around you dissolve, leaving only the weight of numbers, never precise, always debated, and forever entangled with the human tendency to measure tragedy in tallies rather than names. The stone walls crumble into dust, and suddenly the night air feels damp, salty, restless. You hear the splash of oars and the creak of ropes. Now you're at sea. The medieval ocean yawns wide before you, filled with flickering lanterns and shadowy hulls. Tonight you drift into the battles that unfolded on water, where body counts sank beneath the waves and numbers blurred into mystery. One mainstream fact: naval clashes in the Middle Ages often left surprisingly vague records of casualties. Unlike a battlefield, where corpses could be counted or at least estimated, the sea swallowed its dead. Chroniclers of the Battle of Sluis in 1340, during the 100 Years' War, claim the French lost anywhere between 16,000 and 20,000 men. An astonishing figure, though many modern historians doubt it. Did the English scribes inflate the number to paint their victory as glorious? Historians still argue whether the tally was wildly exaggerated or closer to reality. You lean over the side of an imaginary ship, the water glinting in the moonlight. Imagine hundreds of men crammed onto wooden decks, fire ships drifting closer, and boarding parties leaping across with axes and hooks. Once the chaos began, keeping track of deaths was impossible. Who drowned? Who burned? Who was simply lost overboard and never recorded? The quirky tidbit: some Venetian sources claimed that fish around the Adriatic grew fat and plentiful after battles, feasting on the bodies that tumbled into the sea. It's grim, but in a way it's nature's own ledger, though not the sort historians prefer to consult. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571, though technically post-medieval, carried forward the same uncertainty. Chroniclers spoke of over 30,000 Ottoman casualties, yet debates persist about whether these figures were inflated for Christian morale. At sea, you realize casualty numbers were as fluid as the water itself. You pace along the deck, the creak of timbers beneath you, and think about how sailors must have measured loss. Not in giant numbers, but in missing faces: the shipmate who once shared a joke at dawn, the helmsman whose steady hands were suddenly gone. Their body counts weren't in chronicles. They were in the empty bunks below deck. And when storms struck during campaigns, the sea itself often claimed more than any battle. Chronicles of the 1281 Mongol invasion of Japan tell of entire fleets smashed by typhoons, with casualty claims soaring into the tens of thousands. Was it 30,000, 100,000, or simply too many to count? Even now, scholars debate the numbers, but the sea remains silent on the matter. As the waves lap softly against the hull, you feel yourself swaying, eyelids heavy. The ocean doesn't tally, it swallows. And in that silence, you realize medieval naval body counts were never meant to be precise. They were meant to sound awe-inspiring, terrifying, or comforting, depending on who told the tale. And so, the waves carry you onward. The battles fade, the tallies blur, and all that remains is the rhythm of the sea. A cradle rocking you gently into the final rest of this long journey. The sea is calm now. The ships are gone. The lanterns that once swung above the decks have been snuffed out, leaving only the stars, scattered faintly like the glowing embers of a dying fire. You are no longer on a battlefield, or in a courtroom, or behind a crumbling wall. You are simply here, in the quiet, floating weightlessly through a space where numbers no longer matter. Let the stories you've wandered through, the clashing nights, the hungry villagers, the endless sieges, drift away like smoke. The body counts that once sounded immense now soften into nothing more than echoes, indistinct and far off, dissolving into the haze of memory. The tension in your shoulders releases, the breath in your chest slows, and the numbers that once rose and fell so fiercely lose all urgency. Every step you took through this long night has brought you here, to a place of stillness. The grass of Hastings, the poetry of Sekigahara, the silence of witch trials, the waters of Tenochtitlan, the vast stones of Constantinople. They've all receded into the distance, leaving you lighter with each passing moment. Here, you don't need to measure anything. Not time, not tallies, not victories or defeats. The only rhythm left is your breath. Steady, even, safe. The soft hum of the fan, the faint rustle of sheets, the quiet comfort of knowing you are exactly where you need to be. So close your eyes a little deeper now. Let the last fragments of story blur into dreams. Rest in the knowledge that history is always bigger than numbers, and sleep is always kinder than memory. And as the final wave of this journey carries you away, may you drift into the gentlest, deepest sleep.